On the evening of the 21st of May 1927, a crowd of 150,000 people crowded Paris's Le Bourget airport to witness a historic event. Around 10:15 p.m, a droning sound was heard in the distance, and moments later, a small silver aircraft swooped into view, shimmering in the glare of the runway lights. The plane had barely rolled to a halt when the crowd descended upon it, tearing scraps of fabric from the fuselage as souvenirs and hoisting the pilot onto their shoulders in triumph. That pilot, 25-year-old Charles Lindbergh, had just flown his aircraft, the Spirit of St. Louis, 5,800 kilometres from New York to Paris, crossing the Atlantic in 33 hours and 30 minutes. But while his pioneering flight would forever be fated as one of the key milestones in aviation history, lucky Lindy was not, in fact, the first pilot to fly across the Atlantic, nor the second, nor the third, nor even the 50th. He was simply the first to make a non-stop solo crossing between two major city centres. While his was certainly a monumental feat, Lindbergh stood on the shoulders of dozens of pilots who risked and sometimes lost their lives to conquer the treacherous Atlantic and make the world a little bit smaller. This is the story of those forgotten pilots. Ever since humans learned to fly, they have been drawn to the romance and challenge of crossing vast bodies of water. On January 7, 1785, a mere 3 years after the Montgolfier brothers made the first hot air balloon ascent, aeronauts Jean-Pierre Blanchard and John Jeffreys made the first crossing of the English Channel by balloon. On July 25, 1909, only 6 years after the Wright brothers' pioneering flights, pilot Louis Blériot repeated the feat in a heavier-than-air craft. But while aviation advanced leaps and bounds throughout the 1900s and 1910s, the ever-sophisticated machines flying longer and longer distances, one challenge loomed large in the imagination of the pilots: the mighty Atlantic Ocean. For many in the mid-1910s, the task seemed insurmountable. Even at its narrowest point between Newfoundland and Ireland, the Atlantic was 3 times wider than the longest distance an aeroplane had yet flown, and could throw up sudden violent gales and freezing fog that could tear an aircraft apart or coat it in ice and send it spiraling into the waves below. Meanwhile, aircraft at the time were fragile constructions of wood, canvas and wire, engines were temperamental and unreliable, and navigation methods were rudimentary at best. Yet a bold few believed it could be done. Among these was Alfred Lord Northcliffe, owner of the Daily Mail newspaper, who in 1913 announced a £10,000 prize for the aviator who shall first cross the Atlantic in an aeroplane in flight from any point in the United States, Canada or Newfoundland to any point in Great Britain or Ireland in 72 consecutive hours. The flight may be made either way across the Atlantic. Unfortunately, before anyone could rise to Northcliffe's challenge, the outbreak of the First World War intervened. This turned out to be a blessing in disguise, for the war drove a veritable quantum leap in aviation technology. By the end of the conflict, engine reliability had increased nearly tenfold, and firms such as Vickers, Handley Page, Zeppelin and Gotha had developed giant bomber aircraft capable of flying non-stop from London and Berlin or vice versa. Such advances finally brought an aerial transatlantic crossing within the realm of possibility, and there were no shortages of pilots willing to take up the challenge. By April 1919, there were no less than 6 teams in contention for the Daily Mail prize. British aircraft manufacturer Sopwith brought on Australian test pilot Harry Hawker and navigator Mackenzie Grieve to fly their new Atlantic biplane. Custom built for the attempt, the Atlantic featured landing gear that could be jettisoned to reduce drag and a rear fuselage that could be converted into a lifeboat in the event of an ocean ditching. Meanwhile, the Handley Page Company hired Rear Admiral Sir Mark Kerr and Major H.G. Brackley to fly a modified version of its own V-1500 bomber, while the Martinsyde Company hired Freddie Raynham and C.W. Morgan to fly its F-4 Buzzard. There was also Major J.C.P. Wood and Captain C.C. Wiley flying a modified short shell dubbed the Shamrock. Swedish-American pilot Hugo Sunset flying a custom-built biplane named Sunrise, and finally, the latecomers to the competition, veteran World War I pilots John Alcock and Arthur Brown flying a modified Vickers Vimy bomber. But as eager and skilled as the competitors were, early aviation was a fickle and dangerous game, and a series of mishaps forced team after team to drop out of the competition. The first to forfeit the race was Hugo Sunstead, whose Sunrise was destroyed in a crash off Bayonne, New Jersey in February 1919, before he could even make his transatlantic attempt. The first to actually attempt the crossing was Major J.C.P. Wood, who on April the 8th took off from Eastchurch, England and headed west. But 22 miles past Holyhead in Wales, Shamrock's engine quit and Wood was forced to ditch into the Irish Sea, where he was soon rescued by a passing ship. In a way, Wood was lucky, for the prevailing winds of the Atlantic blow west to east. Fighting against such ferocious headwinds would have quickly depleted Shamrock's fuel, forcing Wood down in the frigid North Atlantic, where his chances of rescue would have been nil. For this reason, most of the competitors chose to make the crossing in the opposite direction. By May 1919, the remaining 4 teams and their aircraft had arrived in Newfoundland and begun searching for suitable fields to take take off from. This proved something of a challenge, with one reporter describing the Handley-Page team's chosen site near Harbour Grace as not one field but a series of gardens and farms with rock walls between them. All of those had to be removed, as did 3 houses and a farm building. A heavy roller drawn by 3 horses and weighed down with several hundred pounds of iron bars eliminated the hummocks. The result, after a month, was a bumpy aerodrome. But the greatest obstacle facing the pilots was one they could do nothing about: the weather. Day after day, the teams waited at their respective airfields for the grey skies to clear, only to return to their hotels in defeat. Frustrated and anxious, the pilots let off steam by playing practical jokes on reporters sent to cover their transatlantic flights, such as hiding fish in their beds or feeding them nonsense stories about homing pigeons to navigate across the ocean. Finally, on May the 18th, the weather had cleared sufficiently that the Sopwith and Martenside teams decided to have a go at the crossing. First off the line were Harry Hawker and Mackenzie Grieve, whose Sopwith Atlantic rumbled into the air at 3:40 p.m. They were followed 2 hours later by Freddie Raynham and C.W. Morgan in their Martinsdale Buzzard, which they dubbed Raymore after the first 3 letters of their respective names. However, just after lifting off, the heavily laden plane slammed back to Earth, damaging it beyond repair and severely injuring Morgan. It looked as though Hawker and Grieve would be the first to cross the Atlantic, but it soon became clear that something had gone dreadfully wrong. Despite both the Atlantic and a line of ships along her planned route being equipped with radios, no word had been heard since the aircraft had taken off. The other competitors waited anxiously until the aircraft's 22-hour fuel supply was exhausted, at which point they began to fear the worst. In St. John's, the capital of Newfoundland, flags were lowered to half-mast. Then, on May the 25th, a telegram arrived bearing good news. Hawker and Grieve had landed safely in Scotland, but they had not arrived by air. Barely an hour into their flight, their radio had failed, while 3 hours later a clogged water filter had caused their engine to overheat and their radiator to start venting coolant. Soon they had expended most of their fuel, forcing them to ditch in the North Atlantic. Luckily, before coming down, they managed to spot and flag down a passing Dutch tramp steamer, the Mary, whose crew rescued them after half an hour spent bobbing in the cold, wave-lashed ocean. Adding insult to injury, 2 days after making landfall, Hawker and Grieve learned they'd been beaten across the Atlantic, sort of. On May the 16th, 3 United States Navy Curtiss flying boats designated NC-1, NC-3 and NC-4 set off from Trepassey Bay, Newfoundland, bound for Lisbon, Portugal. The aircraft and their crews were not, however, competing for the Daily Mail prize. Their flight was intended as a demonstration of naval air power. Nor was the flight independent or non-stop. Instead, a line of 41 US Navy destroyers were stationed along the route to act as navigation beacons while a refueling stop was planned in the Azores. The 3 aircraft flew steadily for around half a day until heavy rain and fog caused NC-1 and NC-3 to become separated and forced them to put down on the water. The crew of NC-1 abandoned their aircraft and were rescued by the Greek steamer SS Ionia, while NC-3 rode out the storm for 62 hours before turning her engine on and taxiing the remaining 240 kilometres into Horta Harbour in the Azores. Only the NC-4 flew on, landing in Horta after 15 hours, 18 minutes flying time. On May the 27th, after undergoing a series of repairs, NC-4 carried on to Lisbon, becoming the first aircraft to cross the Atlantic. Total travel time, 10 days, 22 hours, 3 times slower than the fastest ocean liners on record, but a tantalizing taste of things to come. As the Navy's historic flight had taken over 72 hours to complete, the Daily Mail prize was still anyone's for the taking. The race was now between Rear Admiral Kerr and his Handley-Page and Alcock and Brown with their Vickers Vimy. Although at the time there appeared to be no question as to who would be first to cross the line. Not only was Alcock and Brown's aircraft the last to arrive in Newfoundland, but they had not yet managed to find a suitable field from which to take off. This soon changed thanks to a local named Lester who located a suitable stretch of relatively flat pasture, which Alcock and Brown dubbed Leicester Field in his honour. Then there was the formidable task of assembling their Vickers Vimy, which arrived on April the 26th, packed in 4 massive crates. As there was no building large enough to accommodate the giant aircraft, assembly had to be carried out in the open, with canvas screens keeping out the worst of the frigid Newfoundland winds. Despite frequent periods of snow and freezing rain, Alcock, Brown, and the team of mechanics and fitters who accompanied them from England managed to put the aircraft together in 14 days, a miraculous feat given the primitive working conditions. But no sooner had the aircraft and its runway been completed than the distinctive drone of Admiral Kerr's Handley-Page was heard overhead. For a terrible moment, Alcock and Brown thought that Kerr had begun his transatlantic attempt, but it turned out to be only a test flight. Feeling the pressure mounting, Alcock and Brown began preparations to set off as soon as possible. They left nothing to chance. Wary of an engine failure of the kind that had scuppered Hawker and Grieve's attempt, they meticulously filtered their fuel and radiator fluid to remove any impurities. Under his flight suit, Alcock wore a serge waistcoat with built-in inflatable life preserver, while Brown wore an electrically heated jacket and boot insoles. They also carried a pair of stuffed black cats named Lucky Jim and Twinkle Toe as good luck charms, while a workman nailed a horseshoe to the bottom of Alcock's seat. On June 14, 1919, the weather finally cleared, and at 1:45 p.m, Alcock and Brown finished fueling up the Vimy and roared off down Leicester Field. The aircraft, weighed down with fuel, barely managed to limp into the air before it ran out of runway. Minutes later, the aircraft disappeared over the horizon, and Alcock and Brown were on their own. It was to prove an eventful flight. Within an hour, they ran into heavy clouds and fog, blotting out the sun and making navigation impossible. Then one of their engine exhaust pipes overheated, crumpled, and broke off, unleashing a blowtorch of flames dangerously close to the flammable fabric and wood fuselage. But the real trouble began some 12 hours later, when the fog grew even thicker. With no horizon for reference and his primitive flight instruments useless, Alcock became disorientated, and the aircraft began to climb, dive, and roll erratically, eventually stalling and spiraling out of control. When the aircraft finally broke through the bottom of the clouds, it was completely inverted and barely 100 feet above the ocean. While it may seem strange a professional, accomplished pilot could be flying upside down without knowing, this type of thing is not only extremely common when flying within clouds when relevant orientation instruments fail, but almost inevitable owing to the tricks your mind plays on your equilibrium in those conditions without any outside visual references. Now able to see, however, and mustering all of his piloting skills, Alcock managed to right the aircraft and pull out of the dive, skimming barely 50 feet over the waves. But the pair's troubles were not over, with Brown spending much of the remaining flight trying to keep the instruments and engines free of accumulating ice. At last, however, Alcock and Brown spotted the Irish coast near Clifton and came in for a landing. But there was to be one final hitch, for what appeared to be a smooth green landing field was in fact a bog, and as the Vimy touched down, its wheels dug into the soft ground and the giant aircraft pitched forward and crumpled into a tangled mess. Alcock and Brown, however, were unhurt and scrambled from the wreckage, having crossed the Atlantic Ocean in 16 hours 28 minutes. Back in Newfoundland, Admiral Kerr decided there was no point in coming second and abandoned his crossing attempt. Alcock and Brown were feted throughout the British Empire for their feat, receiving the Daily Mail Prize from then Secretary of State for War and Air Winston Churchill and being knighted by King George V. Their historic flight opened the floodgates for transatlantic air travel. Barely 2 weeks later, the Royal Air Force rigid airship R-34 made the first east-to-west Atlantic crossing, flying from East Fortune, Scotland to Long Island, New York, between July 2nd and 6th. 1919. As the American ground crew was not experienced in handling giant airships, Major E.M. Pritchard parachuted to Earth to direct the landing operations, becoming the first person to reach American soil from Europe by air. The R-34 was also the first aircraft to complete a round-trip Atlantic crossing, arriving back in the UK on July the 13th. 3 years later, the first aerial crossing of the South Atlantic was performed by Portuguese pilots Carlos Coutinho and Sacadura Cabral, flying a Fairey 3 seaplane dubbed the Lusitania. The aircraft did not have sufficient range to fly from Lisbon to Rio de Janeiro nonstop, so the aviators completed the crossing in stages, with stops in the Canary Islands, Cape Verde, the St. Peter and Paul archipelago, and the Ferdinand and Noronha Islands. The pair departed Lisbon on March 30th, 1922, and at first all seemed to go well. However, on April the 17th, upon reaching the St. Peter and Paul archipelago, the Lusitania lost a float and sank. Coutinho and Cabral were rescued by a Portuguese warship, and a second aircraft dubbed the Patria was procured to complete the journey. The pair set off again on May 11th, but engine trouble once again forced them to ditch and be rescued by a passing ship. Yet another aircraft, the Santa Cruz, was procured, and the crossing was finally completed, with Coutinho and Cabral arriving in Rio on June the 17th. While the entire journey had taken a whopping 79 days, the total flying time was a far more respectable 62 hours and 26 minutes. 4 years later, Coutinho and Cabral's grueling crossing would be more successfully repeated by Plus Ultra, a Dornier Val flying boat commanded by Spanish aviator Captain Ramon Franco. Setting off from Huelva, Spain on January the 22nd, Plus Ultra covered the same course in just under 60 continuous hours. A year later, Argos, another Val captained by Portuguese aviator Sarmento de Barres, completed the first nighttime crossing of the South Atlantic, flying from the Biagos archipelago off Portuguese Guinea in West Africa to Ferdinand de Noronha Island in Brazil between April the 12th and 17th, 1927. But arduous multi-stage journeys by flying boat were hardly the most comfortable and convenient means of crossing the Atlantic. If international air travel was to truly take off, aircraft would have to be developed which could make the crossing between major city centres non-stop. And so it was that in May 1919, French-born American hotelier Raymond Ortig sent the following letter to Alan Hawley, president of the Aero Club of America. As a stimulus to courageous aviators, I desire to offer, through the auspices of the Aero Club of America, a prize of $25,000 to be awarded to the first aviator of any allied country crossing the Atlantic in one flight from Paris to New York or New York to Paris. All details in your care. Given that Alcock and Brown had yet to make their relatively short Atlantic crossing, this was an extraordinarily ambitious challenge. So ambitious, in fact, that it would be a full 7 years before the first pilot would attempt to win Ortig's Prize. That pilot was René Fonck, the top Allied fighter race of the First World War, with 75 aerial combat victories. In 1925, Fonck teamed up with Russian-American aircraft manufacturer Igor Sikorsky to design an aircraft capable of crossing the Atlantic non-stop, the S-35. Powered by three 425-horsepower engines, the S-35 was essentially a flying fuel tank capable of carrying some 6,800 kilograms of fuel in its wings and behind its outboard engines. But this was no Spartan vehicle. Anticipating its future use as an airliner, Sikorsky lavishly appointed the interior in mahogany and leather trim. But this same attention to detail would not be lavished on preparations for the flight itself, a decision which was to have disastrous consequences. Pressured by news that his competitors were close to attempting their own transatlantic flights, Fonck decided not to test fly the S-35 with a full fuel load. On September the 20th, 1926, he and his crew of three climbed aboard the aircraft and roared down the runway at Roosevelt Field, New York. The heavily laden aircraft accelerated slowly up the entire runway and then into a gully, bursting into flames. Fonck and the radio operator Charles Lindbergh managed to escape, but the remaining crew were trapped in the wreckage and burned to death. Waiting in the wings were three frontrunners in the race across the Atlantic. The first was Clarence Chamberlain, a test pilot for the Wright Aeronautical Corporation. In 1926, Chamberlain joined forces with Sicilian-born aircraft designer Giuseppe Bellanca to produce the Wright Bellanca WB-2, one of the most advanced aircraft of its day. Unlike Sikorsky and Fonck, Chamberlain and Bellanca realized that multi-engined biplanes were inefficient and obsolete, and that the winning formula for non-stop transatlantic flight lay instead in a lightweight, streamlined monoplane powered by a single powerful engine like Wright's new ultra-efficient Whirlwind J5C. A similar approach was taken by Chamberlain's main competitor, United States Naval Commander Richard E. Byrd, who, along with pilot Floyd Bennett, became the first person to reach the North Pole by air on May 9, 1926. The flight had been completed in a Fokker F-7 tri-motor, the same type of aircraft with which Byrd hoped to cross the Atlantic. Rounding out the trio of competitors was Lieutenant Commander Noel Davis, who would attempt the crossing in a modified Keystone Aviation Pathfinder bomber, which he dubbed the American Legion. Yet despite significant technological advances since Alcock and Brown's day, transatlantic flight remained a capricious undertaking, and just as before, mishaps and misfortunes caused the Ortig Prize competitors to drop out of the race one by one. On April 16, 1927, Dutch aircraft designer Anthony Fokker took Admiral Byrd and two passengers up for a test flight in Byrd's new tri-motor. The weight of the extra passengers unbalanced the aircraft and it crashed on landing, injuring 3 passengers. 10 days later, American Legion rumbled off the runway at Langley Field, Virginia, with Noel Davis at the controls. However, the overloaded plane struggled to remain airborne and crashed into a nearby marsh, killing Davis and co-pilot Lieutenant Stanton Wooster. Around this time, Chamberlain was also forced to make an emergency landing in his Wright Bellanca, but luckily he escaped injury, and the aircraft was repaired within days. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, another team was preparing to challenge the mighty Atlantic, albeit in the opposite direction. Charles Lindbergh was a decorated French World War I ace with 43 aerial victories to his name and a reputation for daring. His navigator, François Colli, was equally accomplished, having commanded a fighter squadron during the war and completed the first double aerial crossing of the Mediterranean in 1919. Though once celebrated as war heroes, by the 1920s, both men's stars had fallen, their exploits forgotten by a France eager to put the war behind them. Becoming the first to cross the Atlantic would restore to the pilots the honour and glory they so desperately craved. Working with the Levasseur Aircraft Company, Nungesser and Colli produced a specially modified version of the company's PL-8 naval biplane, which they dubbed L'Oiseau Blanc, or White Bird. Among its unique features, the aircraft's landing gear could be jettisoned to reduce drag, while its fuselage was specifically reinforced and sealed to allow for a water landing in New York Harbor. After completing a series of test flights and training themselves to stay awake for up to 60 hours, on May 7, 1927, Nungesser and Colli moved L'Oiseau Blanc to Paris's Le Bourget airfield and waited for the weather over the Atlantic to clear. As with Major Wood 8 years earlier, Nungesser and Colli's choice to fly the Atlantic east to west was an extraordinarily risky one, for even a small headwind could quickly deplete their fuel and force them down well short of their destination. But Nungesser insisted it was absurd for a Frenchman to travel by ship to America just to return to France by air, and on May 8th, he and Colli climbed aboard L'Oiseau Blanc and trundled into the air, heading northwest across the English Channel. Some hours later, the aircraft was spotted near the town of Dungarvan in Ireland, flying into a strong headwind. It was the last time anyone would see them alive. Throughout France, citizens eagerly awaited news of the two aviators, while across the Atlantic, crowds gathered around New York Harbor to witness their triumphant arrival. But despite multiple reported sightings throughout the eastern seaboard, Le Sceau Blanc never materialized. The aircraft carried enough fuel for around 42 hours of flight. When this had elapsed, it became clear that they'd been lost at sea. Despite extensive searches, no trace of Le Sceau Blanc has ever been found, and the fate of its two pilots remains a mystery to this day. But the tragic news of their disappearance would not dominate the headlines for long. For less than 2 weeks later, the Ortig Prize was finally won by an unknown dark horse competitor named Charles Lindbergh, but that's a story for another video. The heroic and sometimes ill-fated efforts of pilots like Lindbergh, Alcock, Brown, and Curly triggered a revolution in aerial transport that would forever transform how we travel and see the world. So the next time you find yourself complaining about the in-flight meal selection as you wing your way across the Atlantic at 3/4 the speed of sound, spare a thought for these early pioneers shivering in open cockpits as they struggled to guide their glorified kites through snow, freezing rain, and gale-force winds. Now, meat, fish, or vegetarian? Bonus fact. While the R-34 was the first airship to successfully cross the Atlantic, it was not the first to attempt the feat. That honor belongs to the non-rigid airship America, originally built for American explorer Walter Wellman's 1907 attempt to reach the North Pole by air. When this expedition failed, Wellman set his sights on conquering the Atlantic. Setting off from Atlantic City, New Jersey on October 15, 1910, America struggled its way up the East Coast, strong winds and poor visibility making navigation difficult. Eventually, the engine failed, forcing the airship down off the coast of New Hampshire. But before this, the crew faced another unexpected problem in the form of the ship's cat, Kiddo. Apparently none too pleased at being airborne, Kiddo started running amok through the cabin, prompting navigator F. Murray Simon to write in the ship's log, "I am chiefly worried about our cat. He is rushing around the airship like a squirrel in a cage. I believe it's going mad." The situation got so bad that Melvin Vanneman, the chief engineer, used the airship's state-of-the-art spark gap radio to call ashore for help, signaling, "Roy, come and get this goddamn cat." This was one of the first air-to-ground transmissions in history, proving that whenever a new form of communication is invented, people will inevitably use it to talk about cats.